185 votes the difference. South Africa's African National Congress has a new party leader. 65-year-old Cyril Ramaphosa edging 68-year-old Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, two mainstays of the party of Mandela, a party that for the first time since the end of apartheid could actually lose power in the 2019 general election if it plays its cards wrong. We're going to see why and ask if Ramaphosa can now appeal to that born-free generation that grew up after 1991 and the end of apartheid. A generation for whom the struggles of yesteryear are fading from memory as they face the struggles of today, growing inequality, grievances with education and basic services, corruption, and how simmering resentment weighs on the ANC, and a rainbow nation where the blacks are the poorest. Of course, there's Jacob Zuma himself, the outgoing president. How should his party and his successor handle the scandals that surround an outgoing president that retains a strong following within the party? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the fight for the ANC's future. And joining us, Daniel Silk, Director of Political Futures Consulting. Thank you for being with us.
Yes, good to be with you.
We also want to welcome Francis Hurd, anchor and reporter for state public broadcaster SABC. Welcome to the show.
Good evening to you, Francis.
And in the studio, we're pleased to welcome back Mo Lowdy, a Paris-based South African DJ and producer. Let's give a free plug here. New record's coming out. It's called Josie Acid.
Josie Acid, indeed.
All right.
Yes.
Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us. A pleasure as always. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter. The hashtag F24debate. This announcement, Francis Hurd, is hot off the presses for us. And there really was suspense till the end.
This was a nail-biting event for almost anybody in South Africa. I can tell you from a journalistic point of view, 10 years ago, there was an event which the media got completely wrong, similar to Brexit in the UK, similar to Donald Trump coming into the United States. At that time, nobody called it that President Jacob Zuma would come in, usurp Thabo Mbeki. Because of that history, there was so much anticipation around this, around the polling, around the fact that these two candidates were close. And as you said, hot off the press, it was announced not too long ago. And Cyril Ramaphosa got 51%. So it really shows you that these two candidates were very close indeed. And from a journalistic perspective, this seems like a huge moment for South Africa. That moment in politics that I spoke about 10 years ago was big. This seems even bigger because of where we are, because we've got one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. Massive poverty, inequality off the chart. And it seems that we've just declined into this economic malaise. So this seemed like a really watershed moment because the economics of these two candidates counted. And you can see in the reaction of the markets and the rand, which has shot up incredibly today, on Friday, yesterday, on speculation that Cyril Ramaphosa would come in. The bank's up today. So the expectation is that he at least can bring growth, which affects everybody in this country right now.
Yeah, high expectations from the markets and from the citizens of South Africa. Ramaphosa, whose turn we thought had come back in 1999, this after rising through the ranks of the anti-apartheid struggle as a mine workers union organizer. He's had several lives, including that of a businessman, becoming one of South Africa's richest men. Rudaba Abbas has more.
With a net worth of around 380 million euros, he is one of South Africa's wealthiest politicians. A trade unionist turned businessman who went on to carve out a career in politics. At 65, Cyril Ramaphosa has had many lives. In 1982, he founded and led the National Union of Mine Workers. The movement organised major strikes, which helped to weaken the apartheid regime. This attracted the attention of the ANC and led to Ramaphosa becoming a close friend of Nelson Mandela.
He led us to freedom. Yes, we all worked with him, but he was the main inspiration that kept our struggle alive.
In 1999, he was tipped to succeed the former president, but he lost out to Thabo Mbeki due to tension within the ANC party. A defeated Ramaphosa left politics to form a new career in business. But he did not sway from politics for too long. In 2012, he was appointed vice president of the ANC. That year, his name was associated with the massacre at the Marikana platinum mine. It was under his administration that police opened fire on strikers, killing 34 people. In 2014, he became deputy president of the country. A favourite of the private sector and multinationals, Ramaphosa is promising to fight corruption and revitalise the economy, which has slowed to a near standstill under Jacob Zuma's presidency.
State capture has definitely had a very negative impact on the economy of our country. Whether people want to accept it or not, it has.
Despite the ups and downs, he remains committed in his desire to lead the country as president.
We'll revisit that term of state capture, which is important for our conversation. First, though, let me turn to Mo Lowd. Are you pleased with this result?
I think it's the best at the moment. I mean, the Zuma brand has been tarnished, but Cyril Ramaphosa is much more closer to business. And what we've seen during the lawmen, the whole situation in Marikana where the miners got killed, it could have been diverted, that situation, but it is the best that South Africa can do at the moment. I mean, the ANC.
The best that the ANC can do at the moment. I sense a tinge of caution in your voice.
Yes, I mean, with the high economical employment, and we don't see how that situation could actually change rapidly. So this is going to take time.
The rhetoric is interesting at this Congress because on the one hand, you heard there that term of state capture, which is effectively Ramaphosa criticizing the outgoing administration for being too involved and perhaps in a corrupt way in the economy, and on the other hand, opposing him. And tell me if I've got this wrong. This more of a militant black nationalist kind of rhetoric.
There is a rhetoric which is happening at the moment, which is very black nationalist, but at the same time, what Cyril Ramaphosa has always aligned himself with is the capitalist. What he has always been is a unionist who turned to become a capitalist and made a lot of money from it. So he will protect much more the interest of those capitalists.
But that's not the ANC rank and file.
No, that's why it's so complex, because having him move from the union and then joining the board of the lawmen, you know, like it's absolutely absurd.
Daniel Silk, he's elected along with an executive where, by the way, they're not all loyal to him, far from it. At this point in time, can Cyril Ramaphosa sort of give a second boost, a second life to the ANC?
Well, I think you've put your finger on the real issue here with this election tonight. We've had a result which is not an ideal victory for Cyril Ramaphosa at all. A win is a win, as the old saying goes, and indeed Ramaphosa did come out ahead. But with such a narrow majority, 51% majority, he really has a very weak mandate. And not only that, but in the top 6 other executive positions elected in the African National Congress conference this evening, the 2 key positions of deputy president of the organization and secretary general of the organization went to key supporters of his chief opponent, Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. And this sort of mixed slate, as we call it in South Africa, really, I would argue, will weaken Ramaphosa's ability to weave his way through these complexities that the other guests have outlined. It's not going to be easy when you've got your two key opponents breathing down your neck, and this complex relationship between introducing more market-friendly policies into our economic policy debate or having more populist economic policies at the same time. That debate and that argument and disagreement is likely to continue unless Ramaphosa can win over his major detractors who are ultimately sitting with him in the top 6 of his political party right now.
And Francis Hurd describing this as a watershed moment. You agree?
Well, I think it would have been more of a watershed moment had more of Ramaphosa's supporters been elected to the top positions. So I'm not convinced it's enough of a watershed position. And I think from a business and investor community, I think they will be happy that Ramaphosa has the top job. But I think they'll be very wary still over the course of the next few months to see whether meaningful change can come to our policy making. Because after all, with nearly a 40% unemployment rate in South Africa, with question marks about our ability to attract investment, both domestic and foreign, we need policies that largely are best practice policies, that are appreciated by the rest of the world. And if Ramaphosa doesn't have it all his own way, then the watershed moment that we still hope for as a result of tonight may still be a long time off.
Francis Hurd, just to go back to what we saw in that report, 1999, Ramaphosa's anointed by Nelson Mandela. He doesn't get, though, the top job. Instead, it goes to Thabo and Mbeki. Has he changed? What's he learned since?
Sure, this is interesting because a former ANC MP has been telling SABC about a moment when Madiba, the former president Nelson Mandela, told her that he in fact regretted overlooking Cyril Ramaphosa. So that's something that she claims Madiba said. Maybe that it is likely he regretted not pushing Cyril Ramaphosa, but as a result of that, Cyril Ramaphosa went out into business, which he always cites as a strength. And you can hear when these two candidates talk about the economy, I think that the sense is that he speaks with understanding, because he's been in business and because he's been so successful. So that is something that he would say he could harness. And he's this paradoxical man with this labor history. Then, like you say, he was tarnished by Marikana. He sent out an email to the police saying, look what's going on. People are being killed. We need concomitant action. And of course, that was just before we had this horrific shootout. So he's been stained by that. They're damaging reports that have come out suggesting that he didn't even read the transformation reports from that mine from Lonmin, that mining house. And of course, this is something that Black South Africans are hugely interested in. How are we going to take companies that are still run by pale male white men and transform? So there's a lot of damage, a lot of good, I guess, because he understands business. He can say that, he can speak to business people on their level, but he's also been tarnished, and I think he really has to prove that he's not in bed with business, that he can attract investment. And he's talking about increasing economic growth to 3%, which will be good for all of us, good for unemployment, good for inequality, as long as he understands that maybe you also have to push the inequality and the transformation and understand where South Africans are right now. So I think his history is changed because of that time with Madiba when he was not supported, but maybe for the good if he can harness the business knowledge, but also bring in the other things that South Africans want to hear.
And when we come back, we're going to take a look at another of his challenges, which is how to handle the outgoing president. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
For 10 years, our observers have been bringing you stories from all over the world.
Je suis Fatoumata Chérif, blogueuse guinéenne et observatrice de France 24. Sur les observateurs, j'ai dénoncé ce qui ne va pas bien chez nous, comme la gestion des déchets, mais j'ai aussi mis en avant des citoyens qui s'engagent pour changer tout cela. En parler dans les observateurs nous a donné beaucoup de visibilité, mais aussi de la crédibilité. J'aime aussi faire connaître au monde les Guinéens qui ont des initiatives pour aider les autres. Alors, joyeux anniversaire aux observateurs de France 24.
Join the observers.
The Observers. Film, verify, share.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories that we're following for you in the newsroom. Fatalities reported when an Amtrak train derails on an overpass above an interstate highway during morning rush hour near Seattle, Washington. Train cars hanging over that highway. None of the fatalities among the motorists below. Cyril Ramaphosa elected by 185 votes as the new chair of South Africa's African National Congress, paving the way for him to succeed Jacob Zuma as the country's president. More on that when we resume the France 24 debate. The United States vetoes a Security Council resolution that calls on Washington to rescind its recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And a hero's welcome for France's world champion female handball team, victors of Sunday's thrilling final over Norway, which puts them on par with the French men, also current world title holders. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. At 65 years old, Cyril Ramaphosa, the one-time trade unionist turned politician and businessman, has just been elected to head South Africa's African National Congress, paving the way for him to become the country's president. With us to talk about it from Johannesburg, Francis Hurd, anchor and reporter for public broadcaster SABC. Welcome back as well to Daniel Silk, who's in Cape Town, the director of Political Futures Consulting, and here in the studio, DJ and producer Mo Loudy. Welcome back to all three of you. We were talking before the break about how this could be a watershed moment for Cyril Ramaphosa taking over an ANC that is divided over how to which way to take the economy, divided over as well how to handle the outgoing president. Jacob Zuma has hung on to power despite being ordered to repay state funds spent on his ranch, kickback allegations over an arms deal, his cozy relationship with the Indian-born Gupta family, accusing the lining of the pockets of Zuma and his sons, even picking cabinet members. Zuma and the Guptas deny any wrongdoing. Here's the outgoing president at the party congress this past weekend.
Being black and successful is being made to be synonymous with being corrupt or being corrupt. The ANC must promote black advancement and success and fight attempts aimed at frustrating and undermining black economic empowerment and affirmative action.
Mo Loudy, when you hear the words there of Jacob Zuma, should we take it at face value? Is he saying, you know, let's help to promote disenfranchised blacks so they can get a step ahead? Or is he in effect saying, is the dog whistle message, if you accuse me of corruption, you're a racist?
It's kind of using that language, the rhetoric that is going on at the moment of black nationalism and trying to really support from the black youth, the black middle class, and saying this is our weapon to fight for economical empowerment. Whereas in reality, what has happened in the past years since he's been in power, there's been no radical change where black people have got more wealth. It's only been an elevation of the few, which is the black elite, which are majorly making money because of the connections that they have towards Zuma. So,
hence this break-off party led by the former youth wing leader of
Julius
the ANC. What's going to happen now that it's no longer going to be Jacob Zuma in power?
Ideally, it would be much more empowered, because you see the positioning of Cyril Ramaphosa is much more closer to business rather than to radically change the country. So there will be no major difference, really. I don't see how that will really shift.
Are we heading, Daniel Silk, for a change where the ANC will be the sort of centrist party and Julius Malema will run the Black Nationalist Party?
Well, look, for Julius Malema, he has struggled to take his own party to anything more than 8% out of the total South African electorate. And the larger opposition party in South Africa, the Democratic Alliance, which is broadly speaking a center-right liberal political party, has 27% of the popular vote. So I think one often gives Mr. Malema and his party far too much airtime, to be perfectly honest. I think within the ANC, though, there's a distinct division over whether to be more populist, more radical, or for that matter, to be more market-friendly. And I think that's where the cleavage in South African politics will eventually come, from those who simply believe, who simply see that populism and radicalism do not result in gains for the country's economy. And ultimately, I think that will create a further schism. So in the end, I think the ANC itself may not last in its current format. These deep divisions on ideology, economic policy, on just how to go about conducting government business, a more moral versus perhaps a more loose belief in ethics in government. These are clashes, critical clashes that I think are still going to play themselves out within the ANC over the course of the next year or two. And we move towards a 2019 election now, where the ANC as the party of liberation simply is not guaranteed of victory, even with Ramaphosa as a more popular head, as has been elected tonight. And I think opposition parties themselves in South Africa will be already strategizing as how to deal with this rather mixed message that the ANC have sent their own top 6 elected officials tonight.
Yeah, so Daniel, tell it to us straight. How should Cyril Ramaphosa handle all the corruption allegations swirling around Jacob Zuma, and how will he handle them?
Well, I think that many South Africans would be quite satisfied, I think initially, to see the earlier retirement of President Zuma. And I've always argued that whoever won the presidential vote in the ANC tonight, both candidates would probably want to see Jacob Zuma retired relatively early, and therefore leaving the door open for them to become president at least for the next year and a half until our election. So I do believe that that would be the first step, to just remove Jacob Zuma as the president of South Africa. But I must tell you also to afford him a degree of dignity. And I think for Cyril Ramaphosa now, given the nature of how this divided party has voted tonight, making sure that Zuma is not hounded, let us say, by the law and by continued legal contestations is, I think, going to be important going forward. Once that is out of the way, clearly, I think Ramaphosa will be able perhaps to set some sort of greater agenda where business, labor, and the state restore the relationship and start to talk to each other. And that, I think, will be an important agenda-setting item for the first year in office for Ramaphosa.
All right, this sort of clearing of the decks, this a new way of looking at the relationship between government and the private sector. Francis heard that's all fine and good, but again, we've just had an election where it was a 65-year-old beating a 68-year-old.
Well, this is one of the criticisms, that what about young people in this party, and they are they are all God. If you look at all the candidates and all those elected, people even complaining about the ANC not appreciating technology. I mean, it took hours and hours to count less than 5,000 votes. So a lot of young people saying, what about us? Although there is this youth league that the ANC has, somewhat tainted as well, seen as part of President Jacob Zuma's camp. So I don't know. This is one of the challenges for Cyril Ramaphosa. He has many, and you both there were talking about one of the contradictions that the ANC is this centrist party. Cyril Ramaphosa represents business interests, but listen to how paradoxical South African politics is, that he is the one who on his slate, his list of preferred candidates to join him in the leadership of the party, one of them was from COSATU, the trade union federation, the umbrella body for many of the unions in South Africa. And that's part of the tripartite alliance, the ANC ruling with Labour. But President Jacob Zuma has fallen out with COSATU completely. He was booed. They did not want to support him. So here you have the business candidate now trying to fix that tripartite alliance to say we can again, as business and Labour, rule South Africa. But these are the kind of tensions that remain in South African politics.
Let me get the reaction of Mo Loudy. Can Cyril Ramaphosa do that? Reconcile with COSATU, which is the big trade union confederation in South Africa? What do you think? And also, just tell us for outsiders watching this, the rhetoric we hear during this party congress. Everybody calls each other comrade. There's this sort of tradition, right, that dates back.
It's a workers' tradition, yes. A tradition that is there for the people, that you're one with the people.
And yet they've elected one of South Africa's wealthiest men.
Yes, because he comes from that tradition. He comes from the union tradition. He was the one who was there ever since the beginning. He was fighting along Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela actually preferred him more than Thabo Mbeki because he felt that he was much more in touch with the people. He knew what was happening with the miners, with the grassroots. So intentionally, that he will be the right candidate. So, but now with what
So can he reconcile with COSATU?
He can. He's a very good strategist, a very good negotiator. He's done that. He's proved that over years and years that he can bring people together from different teams.
And is it healthy for the head of the ruling party to be so enmeshed with the largest trade union? Shouldn't there be a bit of separation?
But that's the complexity of South African politics, with all the business in being involved with the mining and also the people and the workers. So everybody, you see these characters over and over again, that he's head of Lonmin, and he was head of McDonald's, and he was head of the workers' union, and again he comes out as the one on top. So bringing people together, that's how he does it.
Daniel Silk, are there people from that born-free generation, born after the end of apartheid, that are sort of rethinking the relationship between citizens, the private sector, and government?
Well, I do think that there's a generational shift in South Africa. There's no doubt about it. It's a very young country. And we do see younger South Africans think a lot more independently, certainly about their political affiliations. In the last few elections in South Africa, in particular amongst urban South Africans, and that is a large body of young South Africans who have now grown up in cities, they've grown up after apartheid, they've grown up in a very changed urban environment. I think they are looking for serious delivery. They're looking for jobs. They're looking for better education. They're looking for more efficient social services. And I think there are substantial demands now being made on government. The old way of doing business, I think, has come to an end by and large, and that citizens are grappling with exactly how do they go about making their voice heard? Do they do it through civil society? Do they do it through student movements? Do they, for the first time, contemplate voting for a political party that's not the party of their parents' generation. That's not the party of liberation, which is very difficult for them to contemplate. But those thoughts are going through the minds of young South Africans, and they will continue to in greater veracity over the course of the next few years. So I think South African politics is still largely living in the past, if I might say. I think it is yet to catch up with the new dictates and demands of a younger generation, and I think that will shake things up further as we move forward.
Francis Hurd, do you agree? How difficult is it for someone who's younger to vote against the party of their parents and grandparents?
I agree completely. I think that President Jacob Zuma and his guard have relied on a lot of sentimentality around the ANC. Remember, this was the big liberation party, and parents passed it on to their children, a love for the ANC. But I think he's right that especially young urban people are rethinking their alliances. They no longer understand the need to be with the party of their parents. And remember, this is very simplistic. There are so many allegiances, so many emotions around apartheid and what happened in the past, and about the ANC and about those leaders that fought back. So it's much more complicated than we're making out. But I do think that younger voters are a threat unless the ANC starts speaking to them. And out of these two candidates, I would say that Cyril Ramaphosa is perhaps the more modern man. I watched him in Parliament once talking about contraceptives, about AIDS, and speaking very frankly, very openly, in a way that young people understand, sort of sidestepping all the sensitivities, sidestepping some of the traditions whereby you treat older people in certain ways, which the EFF, like you've been talking about, is defying that and shocking a lot of older people. So I would say he's the more modern man, and he seems to have this energy. But again, they have to start strategizing about keeping young people in the party when that sentimentality, that nostalgia, those memories of what has gone before are slowly being lost.
Yeah, and the question as well over how, as South Africa changes, how to stop that growing inequality. All three of you have mentioned it. South Africa, the second richest country in sub-Saharan Africa, but where the richest 1% control 42% of the nation's wealth. And of course, if you break it down, that income inequality along color lines, it's the black majority that is the poorest. I know there's no silver bullet, Mo Lowdy, for fixing South Africa, but if there was one place where the next president of South Africa should focus on to reduce that inequality, where should he start?
First of all, it should be education. Education should be free for all. And you realize that there's all these companies that are making money from South Africa, all these mining companies, but then they're based in European countries where education is free. So the board of these companies have free education for their kids.
But isn't education free in South Africa?
No, it's not free. University is not free. It's very, very expensive. A lot of children cannot afford that. And if your mother is a housekeeper, you cannot afford that. So this has to start. I mean, you have private education, which is very, very expensive. And the schools in South Africa, in the township, they have very poorly equipped. I was very lucky to have been through all the different educational systems. I went to the township, and I went to the private education, the Model C, all this different kind of education, and I've experienced it. Like in the township, there is not even a library in some schools. So by starting to provide for things like that, that could make a huge impact. And once you have a huge amount of the population that is educated, when transformation comes, you would not have riots, you would not have people looting like the situation we saw in Zimbabwe when there was a transition. Immediately, everything went down smoothly. So we need to start with education.
Francis Hurd, you agree?
I think education is huge, and at the beginning of this National Elective Conference of the ANC, President Jacob Zuma did announce fee-free education in universities to be phased in over the next 5 years. But here's a problem that Cyril Ramaphosa has to fix. That's been announced, a lot of uncertainty around where the money will come from. And I don't think that the ANC has been able to respond to the claims that it's giving in to the louder voices. And I'll tell you why, because there's been massive protests on campuses, at universities, about what Mo was talking about, students not being able to afford the fees. So government has given in there, but then we've got research coming out recently showing that 10-year-olds in South Africa can hardly understand what they're reading. Literacy is a huge problem, and we have a major education problem for youngsters who cannot take to the streets and protest. So it does seem like the ANC is being a little bit populist, giving in to the loudest voices, but there's a structural problem with education, and some things that he's got to fix is you need the right people in the right jobs. The ANC has admitted that there's been so-called cadre deployment, where you put politicians you want to reward in key positions, but they are not the ones who understand how to fix education, for example. There's the unions are very strong in education, and a lot of teaching not happening. So this calls for strength.
Don't make teaching a patronage job. It's something that's come up a lot. Francis
People are buying jobs.
People are buying those jobs sometimes, you're saying. I want to thank you so much for joining us today from Johannesburg. I want to thank Daniel Silk in Cape Town, Mo Loudy. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
We saw it's a daunting task that faces the new head of the African National Congress.
Yes, very much so. And plenty of people had expectations about what was going to happen at this ANC conference. Looking at what some of the cartoonists had to say on the issue, Yalo in the Sowetan Live came up with this image, obviously expecting some trouble. Prohibited beyond this point, even plastic chairs and obviously axes and guns, fairly unsurprisingly. Looking at Jonathan Shapiro, or Zapiro to give him his pen name, he was thinking that corruption would be order of the day.
Well, there was a lot of talk of vote buying at the Congress.
Absolutely. And of course, it was the theoretically anti-corruption candidate who won through, Cyril Ramaphosa. And certainly the big talking point for a lot of people online, what has everyone talking and retweeting right now, is the image of Jacob Zuma's face as the announcement was made, because what we can't hear, unfortunately, at the moment, is there is an awful lot of cheering and screaming and clapping, and it's a fairly unimpressed looking...
shall we say subdued?
Yes, I think subdued is a very polite, perhaps, turn of phrase to use there. Other people reacting with this. He now feels like how we feel every time he survives a no-confidence vote. And this tweet says, first Mugabe, now Zuma, 2017 has ended very well for the two South African nations.
Mo Loudy, is there a Zimbabwe effect on politics right now in South Africa, seeing that... because Robert Mugabe was this liberation struggle leader, but who outlived his welcome.
Yes, definitely. I mean, there's a little bit of a connection there. If you look at Zuma trying to empower his wife, his ex-wife, and Mugabe trying to empower his wife in that same position. So yes, there's an outlived welcome that has been happening in Africa. But yeah. And unfortunately, the Zuma situation is much more smooth.
What's interesting to note as well is the stark contrast between the look on Jacob Zuma's face and the reactions outside Cyril Ramaphosa's home in Soweto. Dancing in the streets, as you can see. Obviously, much work yet to be done and many challenges facing him, but certainly people there very happy indeed.
Emma, it's International Migrants Day, and some are trying to turn it into a cause for celebration?
A little bit, yes, which does seem a little bit at odds with the current situation around the globe when it comes to mass migration and immigration. But the United Nations is among those really trying to put a slightly more positive spin on this, saying we recognise the contributions and celebrate the vitality of the world's 258 million migrants. And the message here is to say that evidence overwhelmingly shows that migrants generate economic, social and cultural benefits for societies everywhere. It's also interesting to note that Antonio Guterres, who is himself a migrant, has been tweeting on this issue. He, of course, the Secretary General of the United Nations. He says, I didn't have to risk my life on the journey. Safe migration is a right, not a privilege, which I think flies in the face of an awful lot of what most governments around the world are saying right now. Interestingly, France, among those to be talking about tightening immigration laws. We could see a lot of changes coming in here in the not too distant future. And the Libération newspaper features in particular what happened this weekend down near Briançon in a town called Nevache in the mountains there. 300 mountain workers, so ski guides, those kind of people, actually formed what they called a solidarity rope. They joined together because it's right on the border with Italy, and basically migrants are risking their lives. They are risking freezing to death in those conditions, and what these professionals who know how dangerous these slopes are trying to highlight is the risk and the danger that they face.
All right, Emma James, many thanks for that. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.